Lovely. So what we're going to be talking about today is a little bit about rats. I'm going to talk to you about the art of PAW, and I want to talk a little bit about how we view IPM, and should we start to be calling it something else? Should we start to be calling it IRM, Integrated Risk Management? Or in reality, is it just a little bit of both? So what is IPM? Classically, we understand IPM to be Integrated Pest Management. It classically was a tool devised for agriculture, and we modified it to make it work in pest management. And it applies this escalation approach that we are all so fond of seeing, where we move from environmental to physical to chemical. We pick the right tool for the right job against the right pest. It works well. I think we'll all agree that. So why am I trying to rock the boat here? What I want to talk a little bit about is integrated risk management. What's this? Basically, I think we should focus a little less on the pest and more on the situation. IPM is still at its core. We still apply our IPM. We still apply our escalation approaches. But we need to focus on the bits before and after that as well. The identifying what is not just the pest, but what is the issue? What's the situation? What's the environment that is leading to this problem? Assess that with the tools that we have to hand, respond to it using our IPM structure, and then monitor, record, repeat, generate that information. And what it then looks is a little bit like this, where you have integrated risk management at the fore, where we understand what the risk of the pests are on site. Because once again, IPM simply takes pests as a whole. Whereas in reality, I'm sure you're aware that the risk of a rat, let's say in a car park, is significantly different from the risk of a rat in a switchboard or in the food store. So we start to apply levels of risk. We start to apply levels of pressure when it comes to these pests. And then we have a look as well as what these risks present to site. We focus on that a little bit more. How can we then eliminate this? We start to apply a risk process, our E-stop process, eliminate, substitute, technical controls, operational controls, and then finally what PPE, if for example, that we can use within that as well. But that doesn't preclude our use of IPM. IPM, of course, is going to be identifying the pest, the environment, the source, and the treatment, your PEST. And then we're going to kind of choose the correct control to work with on that. So it's going to look a little bit more like this, where we start to combine those two thought processes together, where we have our escalation approach and we have our more holistic IRM approach, which will give us a much more graded view of the tools that we can use. It's a little less black and white. I can't use this, so I must use this. I can't use that, so I must use that. No, this basically says that if you were to take all of the tools at your disposal, from environmental management, clearing out a ditch, clearing away vegetation, all the way up to our heavy chemical controls, but when you do your pest survey, it's going to give you a minimum level of technical intervention that will be effective. And then when you do your environmental risk assessments, it's going to give you the maximum level at which you can intervene without causing undue stress and risk to the environment. And then everything left behind are the tools appropriate for the job. And you don't just pick one. We use all of them in conjunction. So let's get into that a little bit more. We're going to look now, and I know I'm hilarious, at the art of PAW, strategies and tactics. And for those of you who don't quite understand that pun, because it is obscure and I am a little bit weird, there was a general in China called Sun Tzu, and he was considered to be probably one of the greatest military strategists of all time. And he had this quote which said, "Strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory, but tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. There are no more than 5 musical notes, yet the combination of these 5 notes give rise to more melodies than can ever be heard." Now, this sounds like I'm waxing lyrical and I'm getting a bit philosophical, and those who know me will know that's what I do. But I like this last part of this quote, which is often left off, because if you think about it, that's pest management to its core. We have a finite range of tools at our disposal, yet the combination and the application and how we apply those will give us hundreds of ways to control a rodent infestation or a pest infestation of any kind, to be fair. And I always used to say when I was training, there's no one right way to solve a situation. There are definitely wrong ways, and that's what we need to focus on, understanding the wrong ways of doing things. But there are so many different ways, different approaches that will all end up with the same control. So let's dig down into this a little bit more. Let's dig down into our art of PAW and talk a little bit about strategy and tactics. And I want to start this with a tool that we all use, but I would probably imagine we probably underuse or don't use to its fullest extent. And that's a sitemap. And that sounds really daft, doesn't it? I use my sitemaps. Of course you do. We all write them up. Our treatment reports, our long-term projects, we write them up. We have to. But how many of us just use them as a tool to identify where our boxes are and don't take it any further than that? Because there's a lot of value to be had using a sitemap. So we have this site. This site has rats. So what? What are we going to do about this? Let's dig into this. Sitemaps, in my opinion, are the best way to understand the environment that you're working in. Because walking around your site absolutely will give you that vital information as to the presence and abundance of rodents on site. But often you can't see the full picture. You can't see the wood for the trees. Because when you're walking around, you are walking around a complex three-dimensional environment and actually making those associative leaps with what's happening in one room to the next room, to the roof of the next room, or even to the next building may be difficult to see when you're on the ground. So what happens when you make a sitemap is you can start to make these intuitive leaps because you can start to see the relationships a little easier. You start to thin those woods and you start to see the trees a little better. So what we need to do then is we need to understand these relationships. And I'm going to give you some tools now to try and understand these relationships better. So you can then communicate these relationships better to your clients, so you can have a better communication with them, so you can work with them on these sites. So let's go into this strategy or tactics thing a little bit more. What do I deploy first, strategy or tactics? And it's all well and good talking about strategy and tactics from the point of view of a Chinese general many thousands of years in the past, but what does this mean to us? How does this apply to us? Where am I going with this? If we talk about strategy to begin with, strategy is that overarching plan designed for your long-term goals and objectives. It's a high-level thinking decision that dictates the direction of the program. And they're broad in scope, taking into account all of the resources you have available to you at the time. And generally speaking, when you're saying, what am I going to do and why am I going to do it? That is you dictating strategy. When it comes to tactics, however, tactics are the specific actions you take to implement that strategy. They're the small steps up to the top of the hill, okay? They're short-term, they're detail-orientated, and they mostly focus on the how of how you execute your strategy. And they're much more flexible, as your strategy tends to have to be quite rigid. You want to get from A to B. Your goal is to remove rodents from the site. Your tactic can be flexible, and they should be flexible because things change. So you need to work within those circumstances. Looking at this site, and we're going to take this site as a case study. And those of you who have heard me talk before will know that I'm particularly fond of this site. But we're going to talk about what is the what, okay? What's the problem? What are the risks and what are the goals? And the more flippant of you listening to this, and I'm sure you're shouting in the comments right now, being like, Alex, the problem is I've got rats. But is that the problem? I mean, that's a very closed statement. Is the problem not the fact that I have rats all over the site, or is the problem I've got specifically rats getting into one building? What are the risks? Is this building more at risk than that building? Is this building more at risk than the other building? The goods that they contain within them, what's the risk profiles of that? And what's the ultimate goal? Now, of course, one goal, remove the rats from the site. But for how long? Do I need to reduce the level of rats in a very short period of time? Is there an immediacy to it? Do I need to remove the rats quickly within the next couple of days? Do I need to make sure the rats are gone before winter sets in? What's the goal? Set some timeframes to this. Not just remove the rats, but remove the rats by when or by how many. And then why is there a problem in the first place? Rats don't spontaneously generate out of thin air, although sometimes we'd all be forgiven for thinking they probably do. Why are these risks important? Well, who has established these risk levels? Is it the site? Is it the client? Is it you? Who establishes these risks and why are they important? And why should this goal be more favorable than any other? Why is removing them in 3 days more favorable than removing them in a week or a month? What's the immediacy? Do I have that time frame to implement a strategy which may be more beneficial to the environment? Or do I need to go in hard and fast and make some concessions elsewhere? So this is your strategy. And generally speaking, although this sounds alien to you all, this is what everyone does. When you get that phone call, when you drive to site, when you're driving to the site and you're sitting in the car and you're thinking, without having actually seen the site itself, you're developing your strategy, aren't you? This is what I need to do. This is what the problems are. This is how I need to go about fixing, not how I go about fixing, sorry. This is why I need to fix them. This is the bit, this is the planning, okay? The tactics, however, is how am I going to do these things? How am I going to implement that strategy? How am I going to identify the problem? What tools am I going to need? Tracking dust, cameras, drain cameras. What am I going to do? How am I going to do it? Am I going to measure and quantify the risks? Do I need to employ a risk hierarchy for your IPM? Almost certainly yes. Do I need to do an environmental risk assessment? Absolutely I do. This is how I'm going to quantify the risks on my site. And then from that, when I understand what the problem is, where the problem is, and what my maximum and minimum level of interventions are, what treatment program do I deploy to solve this problem while keeping all of those risks acceptably low? First, we need to look at that one statement I made a couple of slides back, which was this site has rats. Axiomatically true, fundamentally useless. This site does have rats, but what does that mean? Okay, so how many rats are on this site? How am I going to gauge that population? I can do it quantitatively, or I can do it qualitatively. So what I mean by that is qualitative is things that you observe, gnaw marks, footprints, okay? They are evidence of the rats having been there. And the more evidence I find of rats being there, the higher or lower that population is going to be. And it's going to be like a sliding scale of subjective terms. There's a high number of rats, there's a low number of rats based on the number of droppings, footmarks, gnaw marks that I've found. Quantitative, on the other hand, is a bit more data driven. This is things that you can measure. So I put a camera trap down. I noticed in this area, I counted 14 rats, 18 rats, 23 rats. And if I put down monitoring bait, how much bait was consumed over a certain time period? And that can give me an estimation for how many rats there are as well. So with that, you can get an idea, a fairly good idea of how many rats are on your site. It becomes less subjective and becomes a slightly more objective. But this leads us on to the next question, because again, we leave population size at that, don't we? There are a lot of rats here, mate. We need to do something about this. Do we treat the whole site the same though? Are those 100 rats equally distributed over every building, one rat every 5 square feet? Probably not. So what we need to start having a look at now is population distribution. We've got an idea of size. Now we need to have a look at the distribution. And this is where we really start to get the value out of your site map, because we can turn your site map into something that we call a heat map, okay? And a heat map allows us to start to not only understand those relationships that I was talking about before, but actually it starts to give us a platform by which we can communicate these relationships and these issues that we're seeing on these sites. So we start to narrow down. We find that actually our quantitative and our qualitative measures are highlighting that these are the areas around our site which are having the most issues. Moving on from that, then, we can start to have a look at the density of the populations. Because once again, the population of rats over here may be relatively low, whereas the population of rats within this building is relatively high. And with that, again, we're talking about employing a risk factor here. So I'll ask you this question now, and I'll re-ask it at the end, because this is the crux of this particular talk. What we're doing here, should that be the same as what we're doing here or what we're doing here? It's all one site. It's all one client. You're all going to do it in a single visit. But should the control tactics that we employ be the same to achieve the strategy of this site? Arguably, I'm going to say no. So let's move on to this. We've got our largely subjective. We've got 100 rats on the site, and we've got this much more objective, we've got this much more measurable and usable, right, this is where I'm finding the rats, this is their density, this is their distribution. This is where we're going to focus. Moving on from that then, let's start to talk a little bit more about risk in that. Because once again, as I said, your integrated risk approach should not only be looking at the rodents, which is what we classically have looked at before, but it should be looking at the site as well. You should be folding in the risks of that site to your treatment. Sites are very rarely homogeneous in their risk. You will have lower. So if we just take, for example, not just risk to the site, let's take probably one of the easiest one to understand. Risk to the environment, let's say. The risks to the environment of what you do on the periphery of your sites are probably going to be significantly higher than they are in the core of your site. And they're going to be significantly lower when you get right inside the bowels of these buildings. The risks of predatory animals picking up rats in the middle of a super factory, relatively low. The risk of predatory and scavenging animals picking up rats and mice on the periphery of your buildings, relatively high. So again, then you can see that already we are starting to have this graded response. And then you have to establish as well the risk to the site. This building over here, which is containing nothing but cardboard boxes, risk of having rodents in there, although not preferable, and absolutely we need to get them out, is lower than in here when they've got their goods ready to go out and be distributed and dispatched. So the risk to the site of having pests will change as well. And you need to understand that balance. So start applying some risk factors to your site maps as well. And that should help you make a response. Now, when we talk about applying risk, let's go back to our IPM, because that has a really good escalating approach, doesn't it? Because the classic IPM model looks to break these responses down into this escalating approach. You start at the bottom with the lowest impact to the environment, which will be environmental management. And then as you move up through these, moving to physical controls, multi-feed rodenticides, the single-feed rodenticides, those risks escalate proportionally. But to build on this and to expand on this, we can then have a look at our IRM, which then takes the high risk to the site or medium or low risk to the site and then breaks that down into a high environmental risk and a low environmental risk. You start to see that bracketing that I was talking about previously coming more into play here. And so with this, each of these has a different response. It has a different level of intervention. Your low risk to the site, but high risk to the environment is going to have one response, whereas an environment that's a high risk to the site, but potentially a low risk environment is going to have a very different response. So you can see here by applying this second filter, we are going to start getting a different set of results. And we're going to do all of this with our heat maps. We're going to do all of this with our understanding of the site. So let's talk a little bit about motivations. How do we make these decisions? First off, if you're applying chemical controls, let's understand a little bit more about how the different products that we use work. And I'd like to introduce you to an age-old favorite of mine, which is the resistance filter, because resistance, especially in brown rats and house mice in the UK, is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And if you haven't already experienced it, you almost certainly will in the future. And resistance is not just resistance to chemicals, it's going to also be resistance to behaviors as well. We're seeing a lot more behavioral resistance in mice. To the point, and I'm sure you might hear Niall and I talk about this at a later date, certainly at PPC Live, if you're going to be coming along, we're going to be talking about behavioral resistances and the programs that the BPCA have in place to start to try monitoring behavioral resistance alongside the rodenticide resistance action group in the UK. But back to my filter. The filter is exactly that. It's a big funnel where you pour all of your available control options into the top, but your funnel's filled with holes. So what will happen is things fall out to the outside as you go along. So you start with all of your available options, and given the best case scenario where you're not experiencing behavioral resistance, genetic resistance, or the very high levels of genetic resistance that you might be seeing around places like Hampshire and Berkshire, all options are available to you. But as soon as you start to see behavioral resistance, then you're going to need to try and modify your approach. You may need to move from a block to a grain to a non-carbohydrate based bait, or you might be using traps. You might need to move from plastic to wood. You need to do something to alter that animal's judgment, preconditioning of your treatments. So you've got behavioral resistance, which will filter out some of your options. You then have physiological or the minor genetic resistances. With that, they tend to filter out a lot of when we had FGARs, they would have been FGARs. But additionally, as well, in some areas, difenacum is less effective than bromadiolone. You either need to swap from A to B or move up to escalate through to the single feeds and the cholecalciferols in order to achieve the same controls. So your resistance filter basically filters out the control options that you have available to you based on the physiology of that animal. Now, just a really quick recap for those who are new here. When I'm talking about FGARs and SGARs and cholecalciferol and alpha-chlorelose, those are the primary. There are a couple others kicking around the side, but they are the primary chemicals that we use in pest management in the UK. Now, both FGARs and SGARs, which stands for the first generation anticoagulant rodenticides and the second generation anticoagulant rodenticides, both of these are what we call vitamin K antagonists, and often you'll see this reduced down to the acronym AVKs. They both work by inhibiting the enzyme vitamin K epoxide reductase, which is fundamental for producing the precursors to blood clotting factors. So if this enzyme is inhibited, if it doesn't work anymore, all of the chemistry that goes on our body that is responsible for creating blood clotting factors ceases to function, or it doesn't function fast enough to keep up with our need for it. And what this means is over time, slowly but surely, our blood clotting factors will reduce down to a level of 0. And as soon as that happens, we can no longer clot blood. And as soon as that happens, we tend to be in trouble and we will leak in a very embarrassing and terminal way. So that's what the FGARs and the SGARs do. On the flip side, though, cholecalciferol alpha-chlorelose work on a completely different mode of action. They work on a different chemical pathway. Cholecalciferol is basically an overdose of vitamin D. It causes so much vitamin D in the animal's body that it's unable to correctly store it, and this causes an imbalance. It opens up sodium gates, calcium gates, it mobilizes calcium from one part of the body to the other, and causes it to aggregate in places where it really shouldn't. Liver, kidneys, gut. This will then lead to terminal organ failure and kill that animal in a time frame similar to, if not a little faster, than your SGARs. Okay? Alpha-chlorelose, on the other hand, is an isomer of chlorelose, which is a well-known anesthetic. And how that works is it works on animals of a relatively small body size, such as mice, which have a small volume to a very large surface area, so they dissipate a lot of heat. And it basically puts them in anesthesia, it puts them into a coma, they're unable to regulate their body temperature anymore, and they rapidly lose body heat and die as a result of hypothermia. So those are the options we have to us. So this is how the resistance filter works, and these are the chemicals we have at our disposal. Now, single feed or multi-feed? What's your preference? What's your vote? Which do you go for? Where should we go first? Considering that there's no resistance, how do you make the choice between a single feed and a multi-feed? We can look at this in this way, which is, if this is the total amount of food that a brown rat needs to eat in a single day in order to maintain healthy and happy, if you just look at the cholecalciferols, it's going to require just a little under half of their daily food every day. 300-gram rat, 30 grams, about 14.5 grams for a rodent. A rat. Your multi-feed baits, so I've taken an average here, but this is difenacum, it's going to require about 9 or 10 grams. And a single feed, you're looking at between 1 and 2 grams. Now, with this, I hasten to add that when we say multi-feed, we don't necessarily mean multiple nights. We simply mean multiple feeds, because a rodent, a brown rat, will feed probably in about 10 discrete feeding events of a night, which means that at 30 grams, we'll be breaking down to meals of about 3 to 6 grams a piece. Okay, so with that, you will get a single feed, absolutely within that bracket. You'll get a multi-feed, but that simply just means it needs to come back and feed from the same bait placements or similar bait placements a couple of times a night. The same with cholecalciferol. So under normal circumstances, you can see there, all's good. But what happens when we start to change this graph a little bit and we take into account competition for food? Okay. No, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. There is a waste factor, as well, with both multi-feeds. If you have no competition for food whatsoever, if your rodents are so food deprived that your food placements are the only food placements on site, they eat nothing but your bait, then of course, good news. Cholecalciferol has what we call a stop feed effect, because what happens with that then is they'll eat just enough in order to achieve a lethal dose that will start to elicit a physiological response within that animal, which then makes it feel a little nauseous. It stops feeding. And at that point, they eat just enough in order to have that effect, which will then lead to its inevitable demise. Your multi-feeds, however, you could actually probably get 3 lethal doses within that animal in a single night, which is wasteful and also a bit worrying. And when we talk about baiting strategies a little bit later on, you'll see why this is a bit of a problem. The single feeds, we have some issues there. But that's not to say that the single feeds are bad news bears. It simply means that they are to be used in specific situations. Because if we look and we take into account food competition there, if that rodent's only engaging with your bait basements 50% of the time, yes, all options are still viable. If that rodent is only engaging with your bait placements, let's say 80% or 20% of the time, then we start to have a problem. So in high food competition environments, in environments where you can't control the competition for the food, where you're really struggling to get them to change from one food source onto your food source, then suddenly you can see, actually, single feeds are the way to go here, because that guarantees my LD50 with only one approach. And because they're only eating it, it limits the amount of overdoses that they can have. So keep that in mind. Keep in mind your food competition when it comes to this, because single feed or multi-feed isn't just a case of convenience to you. It's a genuine and legitimate tool to factor in to your control strategies. So, deployment strategies then. How should I use these tools? How should I deploy them best? We have 3 well-known strategies. We have saturation baiting, we have pulse baiting, we have speed baiting. Now, I'm going to talk about these, and they're all very good tools, but please bear in mind that labels will specifically state whether or not to use things as a pulse bait or not as a pulse bait, or as a speed bait or not as a speed bait. So although these are interesting tools to know, please make sure that you abide by the label as you use them. To talk about pulse baiting first, because it's probably one of the more interesting ones and more counterintuitive ones. Pulse baiting is believed to, a lot of very interesting research was done on this a long time ago, 1982, but where they looked at saturation baiting and they looked at pulse baiting and they developed these strategies. And these strategies have been around for a long time. And yet, weirdly enough, they're quite brand new knowledge to a lot of us. But Duboc said it's believed that a single feed is required to produce a single and lethal effect. So these are our single feed anticoagulants. It's suggested, therefore, that dominance hierarchies come into play, where basically you will have the dominant animals feeding first, your subordinate animals feeding second, and then the juveniles and the animals which have almost no hierarchical power feeding finally. Now, the risk is if you use a saturation baiting profile, those dominant animals will eat and eat, and they'll eat all the way through that lag period. They will dominate those bait places. The idea of pulse baiting is to put down just enough bait to kill that dominant hierarchy and then wait a week, wait for that animal to perish, and then come back and then bait again and bait again. And the idea is you're baiting in waves, you're baiting in pulses. So how does this differ from our saturation baiting programs? As you can see with saturation baiting programs, the idea is you never let the amount of bait that you have ever diminish to 0. You keep that environment saturated with bait. Another word for this is surplus baiting. And you can see here, it gives much more predictable decline in rodent populations. You start with 100%, you end with a 0%, and you have a more predictable curve. And this is what we all expect to see. The issue with saturation baiting, however, is when you're using highly toxic compounds, those animals get saturated with those particular chemicals as well. And we can have a big risk of that biocumulative effect moving forward into other animals, because the animal that eats on day 1 isn't necessarily going to die until day 3 to 7, depending on that animal's physiology. And so with that, it has the potential to be eating those multiple doses time and time again. It won't work any faster, but at the same time, that animal will be containing more of that chemical just saturated within its tissues. So there are risks to this. This is the classic, this is what we do. This is saturation baiting. But is it the best way? Let's see. Now, when it comes to things like cholecalciferol, it's a very different approach. We apply what's called speed baiting, and that's actually where you take the principles of pulse baiting and reapply that down into a saturation bait, which sounds a little bit weird, because how can you apply one to the other? You've got to wait for them to die, correct? But with cholecalciferol, as I said before, it has this really weird effect where it causes this stop feed effect to occur. And so what happens is instead of having a pulse bait which you force onto that population by time, the pulse bait's enforced into their animals individually because they'll feed and then stop, feed and then stop. So with that, you have a saturation bait in a pulse baiting program, which gives you a curve, which we all recognize. If anyone's used cholecalciferol in the past, such as cilantro, you'll see that you'll have a very rapid decline to begin with as soon as you start to get them, and then you'll have a little tail off at the end. Okay? So with that's your 7-2-7 approach, isn't it? 7 blocks, replenish 2 days later, and then replenish at an interval of 7 days. 7 blocks, 2 days later, and then replenish at 7 days. So speed baiting is phenomenally effective when it comes to using cholecalciferol because it applies both that saturation pulse baiting strategies within that. How am I doing for time now? I think I'm running a little over, aren't I? I'll be quite quick. So here we go. There's an overview of how this works. Now, benefits of pre-baiting a monitor. As you can see here, we do not use monitors to our fullest extent. We tend to use them as a bit of a early warning system, a shot in the dark. But actually, your monitors can be used as what we call a pre-bait by preconditioning the animals to those boxes, by preconditioning them to that bait type. You can see there that this experiment that was done down in the UK zoo, the rats engaged heavily with the pre-trial monitor. And then with that, the lag time, we gave them a lag to make sure that we weren't unduly biasing them, but we preconditioned them. We preconditioned them to eat the monitoring bait, which was of a similar form of function, or a similar sort of like taste and texture to our monitoring bait. And with that, we were getting feed on day one. There was no neophobia, there's no reluctance. We preconditioned them to eat from these boxes. So your monitors can be used as an early warning system, but also, more importantly, they can be used as a pre-validator to those boxes, to those environments to get your rodents feeding faster. Put this into another situation we have here, basically a little, and this is not a park, it's not a good picture, but basically we've got buildings here, and we had a couple of rock piles here. What we were looking at here is we were finding rodents all through this, but we had nearby enclosures. We had nearby enclosures of animals left and right that were being viewed by people. What do we do here? How do we choose which treatment strategy to use? Because, of course, label conditions, as we're all well aware at the moment, prohibit us from baiting away from buildings. So what do we do? First off, we need to establish how many animals are in the environment. As we said before, useless or useful, but fundamentally useless. So what you do then is you apply monitors to that situation. You can put your monitors up and down that situation. You can find out where they are. You can establish then your population density and distribution. And this means that actually we can apply the right tool in our toolkit for the right place, because we can find that actually probably doing something down here, fundamentally useless, something up here is going to have an effect, but actually what we need to focus on is the environmental management and the physical controls in the middle there. It's not going to work if we just operate around the buildings north and south. Deployment tactics. And a very quick overview of these. We have our tamper-resistant bait stations. And I love this picture. This is a picture donated to me by Mr. Oliver Madge. And it is fundamentally everything you should not do with a tamper-resistant bait station in a single picture. But the risks of using TRBs is it's been well established that rodents such as brown rats have a heightened neophobia to novel objects, okay? So again, this is where using your monitors as a pre-validator really comes into its fore. Boxes can be flipped, moved, or damaged if they're not placed securely, and anything smaller than a rat will still be able to gain entry to them. They're not magic. However, there is a lot of rewards with using a TRB, one of the lowest risk deployment tools. They are lockable, so this reduces interference from humans and small humans that we call children. And they're widely available in a range of commercial designs, okay? There is a box for every situation. We've got steel boxes, we've got plastic boxes, we've got ones that look like conducting, ones that look like rocks, even some you attach to the wall and they have to climb up. So we have lots of different options available to us. We have burrow baiting. Now, burrow baiting, very uncontrollable in the sense that as soon as you put that bait down the hole, you lose control over it. And there's a high risk to non-target engagement if that bait is ejected from the burrow while you're not there. And it's very difficult to measure engagement because if food gets dragged further into the burrow, how do you know that they've eaten it or not used it or cached it? Flip side of that is, however, burrow baiting is probably one of the fastest baiting methodologies that you can use. It reduces that time to engagement because it completely bypasses the foraging behavior. You are basically taking the poison to the pest. Okay, so high risks, but high rewards. Now, the little bit that sits in the middle, which is probably the one which is least understood by a lot of us, is covered and protected baiting. Now, with this, You've got to remember those two words. It needs to be covered and it needs to be protected from the environment and from interference from non-target animals, which can make it quite difficult to achieve. But because you're using natural materials, because you're using materials from around the site, there's a higher chance of these boxes getting engaged with by rodents because there's a lower neophobic response to natural materials found around the site. But risks of that, higher interference with non-targets and humans, higher potential for environmental duress, so water ingress or molds. Non-lockable, it's also quite hard to identify this as a bait placement. They tend to be quite submarine, they tend to be quite overt. But as we said before, there's a lower neophobic response, greater visibility of monitoring baits than when you're using burrow baiting tools with there as well. So we have those sliding scales there. You need to decide which one's which. I was going to talk about what we were going to do in each one of these, but I think we're largely running out of time. But what I will say here is hopefully from everything that you've heard me talk about today, you can see that this whole site, which was we had rats, which has then gone to we have rats here and here, and now has moved to we have more rats here than we have there, and these are our high-risk zones. You can see then that actually on this one site, we're not applying just one treatment tactic to apply to achieve our strategies. Over here, we're going to have something that is going to be probably a low number of rodents, quite close to a high environmental risk. We're going to be going in with a low control. Over here, where the numbers are increasing and we've got a higher environmental risk, okay, we're going to be using potentially a different control, and a different control, and a different control. We are going to be applying a control that not just is reliant on the pest, but the pest and the environment and the relationship between the two. There we go. I apologize. I've gone slightly over my time, but thank you ever so much for joining my talk on strategies and tactics and the art of PAW. There we go. How we all go? 3 minutes left, 5 minutes ago.
You're fine. You're absolutely fine, Alex. I'm sure everyone really enjoyed. I really enjoyed it. So yeah, if you do have any questions for Alex, I'm sure he'll be able to hang on for a couple of minutes afterwards to answer those questions as well. And it's certainly a new approach as to IPM, which we know has been adapted for a very long time. It could be our new way of moving forward, but I certainly wouldn't want to speak out of turn on that respect. So I want to say thank you again to Alex. You've got so much love coming in from the chat.
Yes, thank you guys, and apologies. Anyone who's actually heard me talk before knows that I cannot keep within time frame. So to all of my other presenters today, I'm terribly sorry. But to all the BPCA guys over there, thank you very much. To everyone listening and who's taken the time out for this, it's been a great pleasure to come back and speak to you all again. So hopefully I'll see you all before too long. And chuck some, Alex always running over. Chuck some questions in the chat. I'll reply to them as we go along. So thank you very much, guys. Bye.